This is the story of the most famous rock musician you've never heard of. A man who played drums on Derek and the Dominos' legendary Layla, performed on hundreds of the biggest recordings of the 20th century as part of the Wrecking Crew, won a Grammy while locked inside a prison cell, and murdered his own mother with a hammer and a butcher knife. His name was Jim Gordon, and almost nobody knows it. If you've ever listened to classic rock, you've heard Jim Gordon play without realizing it. Carly Simon's "You're So Vain," that's Jim Gordon on drums. Mason Williams' "Classical Gas," Jim Gordon. Glenn Campbell's "Gentle on My Mind," Jim Gordon again. George Harrison's first post-Beatles album, "All Things Must Pass," featured Gordon as one of the main drummers, and John Lennon's "Imagine" did too. The list runs through the Byrds, the Beach Boys, Steely Dan, Alice Cooper, Tom Petty, Joan Baez, Frank Zappa, Barbra Streisand, B. King, and dozens more. Fellow musicians called him the only living metronome, and Rolling Stone magazine ranked him number 59 on their list of the 100 greatest drummers of all time, a ranking that carries extra weight given how short his career actually turned out to be. Hal Blaine, the legendary session drummer, widely considered one of the most recorded musicians in history, put it simply in a 1985 Rolling Stone interview. "When I didn't have the time, I recommended Jim. He was one hell of a drummer." And that raises the obvious question, how does someone like that end up spending nearly 40 years in prison? James Beck Gordon came into the world on July 14, 1945, in Sherman Oaks, a neighborhood in the San Fernando Valley area of Los Angeles. Music ran in the family because his father worked as a studio musician and composer, and the elder Gordon encouraged his son's interest from the beginning. By the time Jim reached high school at Grant High in Van Nuys, he played in both the marching band and the jazz band, and he proved skilled enough to sit in with rock bands in the Burbank Symphony while still a teenager. Graduation in 1963 brought a music scholarship offer from UCLA. Gordon turned it down. What he chose instead tells you everything about who he was at 17 years old, because he joined the Everly Brothers for a tour of England rather than set foot on a college campus. That decision launched him into the Wrecking Crew, the famous group of Los Angeles session musicians who dominated the sound of the 1960s and played on literally hundreds of hit records throughout the decade and into the 70s. Learning under Hal Blaine sharpened his craft, and within a few years, Gordon had become one of the most in-demand drummers in the business. Through the rest of the 60s, his resume grew to resemble the index of a rock history textbook. The Beach Boys, the Byrds, Glenn Campbell, and on and on. 1970 turned out to be the year that defined Jim Gordon's career. During those 12 months, he joined Joe Cocker's legendary Mad Dogs and Englishmen tour, played on George Harrison's "All Things Must Pass," performed with Delaney and Bonnie and Friends, and then came the band that would attach to his name more than any other, Derek and the Dominos. Derek and the Dominos formed in 1970 with a lineup of Eric Clapton, Jim Gordon on drums, Bobby Whitlock on keyboards, and Carl Rattle on bass, while Duane Allman also played guitar during the recording sessions. Together they cut a double album called Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs at Criteria Studios in Miami, Florida, under the guidance of legendary producer Tom Dowd, and the title track went on to become one of the most recognizable songs in rock history. More than 30 million streams and a peak of number 10 on the Billboard Hot 100 in August of 1972 confirm that, even though the song didn't chart until long after the band had already split apart. What most people don't realize about Layla is that the song functions as two separate pieces stitched together. Clapton wrote the first part, that urgent guitar-driven section, about his unrequited love for Pattie Boyd, who at the time was the wife of his best friend George Harrison. But the second half, that wistful, melancholy piano coda that gives the song its emotional gut punch, came from Jim Gordon. The story behind it goes like this. Clapton overheard Gordon playing the piece on piano in the studio after the first section of Layla had already been recorded and asked if he could attach it as a kind of second movement. Gordon agreed, and what makes it even stranger is that he didn't just hand the composition over, he sat down and played the piano part himself. The drummer performed the most famous piano passage of the song. Credit on Layla went to Eric Clapton and Jim Gordon. But here's the thing. There's a problem with that version of events, and it involves a woman named Rita Coolidge. Rita Coolidge served as Jim Gordon's girlfriend back in 1970, working at the time as a backup singer before eventually building a very successful solo career. According to Coolidge, the piano melody that became the Layla coda was not something Gordon composed on his own. She maintains that the two of them wrote it together as part of a song called Time, the full title being Time, Don't Let the World Get in Our Way. Coolidge laid out her account in a memoir from 2016 called Delta Lady, describing how she and Gordon played the song for Eric Clapton at Olympic Studios in England and left him a cassette demo, hoping he might cover it. Nothing came of the meeting, or so she believed. That changed when she heard the finished version of Layla on the radio and recognized her own music filling the song's closing section. Coolidge contacted Clapton's manager, Robert Stigwood, and asked for a writing credit, but Stigwood dismissed her. The official credit on Layla still reads Clapton and Gordon to this day, with no mention of Rita Coolidge anywhere, and she's not alone in telling this story. Bobby Whitlock, the keyboard player in Derek and the Dominos, and someone who was literally in the room during those sessions, publicly backed her up. In a 2011 interview, Whitlock didn't mince words. Jim took the melody from Rita's song and didn't give her credit for writing it. Her boyfriend ripped her off. I knew, but nobody would listen to or believe me. That same composition later surfaced in 1973 when Booker T. Jones and Priscilla Jones, Priscilla being Rita Coolidge's sister, recorded a version of Time. When you listen to it side by side with the Layla coda, the resemblance is difficult to dismiss. Coolidge has mentioned that one consolation was knowing Gordon's songwriting royalties went to his daughter Amy, but officially, she has never received credit. Which means the most famous thing Jim Gordon ever wrote may not have been entirely his to begin with, and that's just the first layer of this story. The songwriting controversy doesn't come close to the darkest chapter of Jim Gordon's life. Evidence of something going wrong surfaced as early as 1969, when Gordon would reportedly stop playing in the middle of a recording take and accuse fellow musicians of being the devil. On Joe Cocker's 1970 Mad Dogs and Englishmen tour, Gordon violently assaulted Rita Coolidge, hitting her so hard that, by her own account, she lifted off the floor and slammed against the wall on the opposite side of the hallway. The attack came without warning. Most people in Gordon's orbit chalked the behavior up to drugs, and the substance abuse was certainly real. Alcoholism and drug addiction followed him through the entire decade of the 1970s. Gordon himself acknowledged this in a 1985 Rolling Stone interview. "I guess I was an alcoholic. Before I was drinking every night, but I wasn't getting up in the morning for a drink. I would put a needle in my arm." But the drugs only accounted for part of the picture, because Jim Gordon had been hearing voices in his head, some of them since an early age. The most dominant of those voices belonged to his mother, and the demands were relentless. Eat less, stop sleeping, stop touring. The voices reportedly threatened to destroy his gold records. At one point, they drove him to abandon a gig as Paul Anka's drummer during a Las Vegas residency, and Gordon simply fled. Violence escalated alongside the paranoia. Gordon assaulted singer Renee Armand, to whom he was briefly married, and attacked another girlfriend as well. Word traveled through the music industry, and the phone stopped ringing. By the mid-1970s, the most sought-after session drummer in Los Angeles could barely get a call back. And this is where the story shifts from tragic to infuriating. Beginning in 1978, according to court records, Jim Gordon voluntarily sought psychiatric treatment at least 15 times. 15 separate occasions where he walked into a hospital and asked for help. Every single time, doctors misdiagnosed him, treating him for alcoholism and never once identifying the schizophrenia. J.D. Souther, who knew Gordon well, captured it perfectly. We knew he was a mess, but nobody knew what kind of a mess. On June 3, 1983, Jim Gordon drove to his mother's house. Osa Marie Gordon was 72 years old. Gordon struck her in the head with a hammer, then stabbed her with a butcher knife. She did not survive. Only after the arrest, only after the murder, did a doctor finally diagnose Jim Gordon with schizophrenia for the first time. 2 years later, in a 1985 interview with Rolling Stone, Gordon described what had happened. "I had no interest in killing her. I had no choice. It was so matter-of-fact, like I was being guided like a zombie." His trial attorney later told the Washington Post that Gordon truly believed he was acting in self-defense against the voice inside his head. Eric Clapton, who had worked closely with Gordon during the Derek and the Dominos era, reflected on it in a 1991 Rolling Stone interview and admitted he never saw it coming. "I had no idea that he had a psychotic history of visions and hearing voices from an early age. That was never apparent when we were working together. It just seemed like bad vibes, the worst kind of bad vibes. I would have never said that he was going mad. To me, it was just the drugs." Gordon's defense team argued insanity at trial in Los Angeles, and the court accepted that he suffered from acute schizophrenia. None of that mattered because California's tough new insanity defense reform laws, arising from federal legislation, had made it nearly impossible to mount a successful insanity plea. The jury found Gordon guilty of second-degree murder, and on July 10, 1984, a judge handed down a sentence of 16 years to life in prison. Parole eligibility first arrived in 1991. The board denied him. They denied him again after that, and again after that. 10 denials in total over the course of decades. But the unusual part wasn't that the parole board kept saying no. The unusual part was that Jim Gordon never attended a single hearing, not one in nearly 40 years. Contact with lawyers, he refused entirely. Visitors heard him say he was institutionalized and had no desire to leave. A Los Angeles deputy district attorney stated at one hearing that Gordon remained seriously psychologically incapacitated and posed a danger when he is not taking his medication. Even his own attorney, Jeffrey Hall, acknowledged it. "I think he would be a threat to himself if he were to be released. I think he'd hurt somebody else." California's elderly parole program, designed to give special consideration to inmates older than 60 who have served 25 or more years, should have applied to Gordon. On paper, he qualified, but the risk assessment deemed him ineligible. And throughout all of this, one of the most surreal details of the entire story played out quietly in the background. A 2005 court document revealed that Jim Gordon was collecting roughly $4,000 a month in royalties while sitting in a prison cell, and the prison disciplined him for giving some of that money to fellow inmates. Then came 1993. Eric Clapton had re-recorded Layla for his Unplugged album, which won Album of the Year. The original songwriting credit still applied. Clapton and Gordon, which meant the Grammy for Best Rock Song, went in part to a man serving a life sentence in a California prison for murdering his mother. Amy Sheaf, Gordon's daughter, managed his finances but maintained no personal contact with him. At a parole hearing, she offered words that carry the weight of decades. "Certainly our family has been traumatized by what happened, but it's been so many years and it doesn't really seem like he's going anywhere at this point." One final thread of this story connects Jim Gordon to an entirely different world of music, one that nobody in 1973 could have predicted. That year, Gordon played drums on a cover of Apache, recorded by a studio project called The Incredible Bongo Band. Nobody bought the record when it came out, but the track contained an unusually long percussion break in the middle. By the late 1970s, early hip-hop DJs, most notably DJ Kool Herc and Grandmaster Flash, had started looping that break to fuel block parties in the Bronx. The Incredible Bongo Band's Apache eventually earned the nickname hip-hop's national anthem. And according to Who Sampled, the track has been sampled in more than 800 songs by artists including the Sugar Hill Gang, LL Cool J, The Roots, Nas, the Beastie Boys, and many others. Kool Herc himself described the impact. Everybody started searching for the perfect beat, trying to beat that record. They still can't beat that record until this day. Jim Gordon's fingerprints don't just cover classic rock, they're embedded in the foundation of hip-hop itself. Drummer Rick Marotta offered a description of Gordon that few people who only know the murder story would expect. I think that people overlook that. Aside from his obvious mental illness, Jim was a really great, gentle guy with so much untapped talent. Jim Gordon spent the rest of his life behind bars, rarely leaving his cell, often resisting medication. A re-diagnosis of schizophrenia came in November 2017, and court records showed he also suffered from delusions and a heart condition. On March 7, 2018, the Parole Board denied him for the 10th time. James Beck Gordon died of natural causes on March 13, 2023, at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, California, at 77 years old. Nearly 4 decades had passed since his sentencing. Holding the full scope of Jim Gordon's life in your head at once feels almost impossible. This was a man whose drumming lives on some of the most beloved recordings ever made. A man whose rhythm helped launch an entire genre of music. A man who co-wrote, or at least co-claimed, one of the most iconic rock songs of the 20th century. And because his illness went undiagnosed for years, despite at least 15 attempts to get help, he took the life of his own mother and spent the rest of his days inside a prison he chose never to try to leave. Stories like this tend to get reduced to simple contrasts. Genius and madness, fame and downfall. But what happened to Jim Gordon goes beyond rock and roll excess. Doctors saw alcoholism where there was schizophrenia. A legal code acknowledged his mental illness, but wouldn't let him mount a defense around it. An industry full of people who worked with him every day looked the other way when the warning signs were right there in the room. The next time you hear Layla, and you will hear it because that song never really goes away, listen to the second half. That quiet, aching piano passage. The man who played it spent the last 39 years of his life in a cell, hearing voices that never stopped. Thanks for watching. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and let me know what you think. And if you haven't already, subscribe because we've got more stories like this one coming.